Hello again. Welcome back to another episode of Living Confident with Nasia. I am here again for another podcast episode where I'm going to be talking about more things to do with my very fascinating, very crazy life. So today I am going to be talking about part 2 of my journey and kind of why I do what I do. And I'm going to dive a little bit more into my journey to understanding my neurodivergence and my neurotype. And I'm going to start there because I feel like that's something that a lot of times people kind of gloss over, is like, yeah, there's neurodivergence, and yeah, it's cute and it's trendy now, and you kind of miss the whole what actually leads someone to get a diagnosis, and then what does that change about their existing life when they've already had a life before a diagnosis. And so you've seen a lot of stories about late diagnosed people who are autistic and all of those different kinds of things. And they're kind of like, I just kind of figured out that I was quirky and that I was weird. And I just, wanted to pursue a diagnosis. Number one, let me be clear before we get into this. My experiences are my experiences. And I will never say that I'm an expert who speaks for all autistic people. A, that I'm an expert, or B, that I speak for all autistic people. I don't. But what I do is I tell my own stories and I talk about my own experiences, and that's what I'm going to do today. So, essentially, it is very, very hard to get a diagnosis in the United States. Okay, there are so many physicians, there are so many psychologists who can allow you to get a diagnosis or who can diagnose you, but a lot of them are not familiar with how to be neuroaffirming, which is the idea of supporting you with their language and with their approach to ensure that you feel seen instead of being a specimen of study. And so it is very hard to find a neuroaffirming person or, psychologist who can support you. It is expensive. The diagnosis that I got was in the thousands. And the only reason I was able to afford that was because at the time I was living at home with my parents and working a full-time job, so I had no rent, and so money for what would have been a rent expense went for a diagnosis expense, and I'm so glad I did that because when I moved out on my own, I definitely can't afford anything like that now. But yeah, I ended up working out a payment plan with the psychologist. What I did to get diagnosed, because a lot of you are asking, how did I get diagnosed? What I did to get diagnosed is I went to a private practice. I did not go to a big firm that gives you a doctor to be able to get diagnosed. I didn't go to a practice. I went to an individual psychologist who was practicing independently with the proper state licensure so that the diagnosis would be accepted, because you need someone who's going to provide you a diagnosis paperwork that is going to be able to that's going to be where they're licensed to practice in your state, but also the documentation will be recognized by state bureaus, by jobs, by schools, anybody who will need that paperwork to give you accommodations, which is the main goal for getting a diagnosis. Other than I want to find out for my own discovery, oftentimes the diagnosis is necessary paper-wise so that you will have a paper trail of asking for a diagnosis and getting the help that you need. You can't qualify for certain programs unless you have that paperwork. So you'll know that there was a recent scandal out with someone in the disability field who was saying that they were offering diagnoses and psychologists who could do them, but the people weren't actually certified or licensed in the state that they were giving the diagnosis in. And so it ended up being this big scandal because people are going and using the paperwork to kind of try and get accommodations and stuff, and it's not being recognized. And people are like, well, what happened? Or the paperwork isn't even conclusive. It's like 1 or 2 pages of like reviews and stuff. And so that became a huge scandal most recently earlier in the year because everyone was like, wait, they're marketing themselves as the most affordable form of a diagnosis, but the majority of what we need a diagnosis for, other than personal exploration, these documents can't actually count. So I didn't use that service. I used a private practice. I used an individual psychologist who I double checked with her licensure pin, was licensed to practice in my state. And you can usually check by looking at their license number and then going on to the respective website, which I will link in the bio. And if you check their license number, it should say that they're qualified to practice not only in their state, but also in the state that you're in, because they cannot give you medical care, treatment, or diagnosis if they're outside of the jurisdiction in which they're licensed. So that is how I found the person to give me a diagnosis. I will link the service that I used in the comments or in the description or the comments below so that you can kind of see who I used and why. But yeah, that's essentially what happened. So what started the whole journey was that I was coming out of the high control religion, which I will get more into in episode 3 or 4, whichever one this is at this point. And I just was coming out of the high control religion where they consistently downplayed mental health and downplayed neurodivergence and said, you don't need to get diagnosed, you don't need to go to doctors, you don't need to go to therapists, you don't need psychologists because you have God or you have Jesus. And I was just like, yeah, no, I'm deconstructing that part first, because I know now that a lot of the things that we experienced and called demons or spiritual warfare was actually just neurodivergence or mental illness, and they are not one and the same. Please do not equate the two. But a lot of times they were being conflated because people who were neurodivergent were going into mental health crisis, were having mental health crises because they weren't getting the proper support as a neurodivergent individual and instead fed false control through high control religion. So I was one of those people that dealt with a lot of mental health struggles because I was neurodivergent, didn't know it or didn't understand it, thought I was delivered from it or healed from it because the community we're in believed in a deliverance ministry. They believed in you could be healed from things. So, long story short, Cicerin did not prioritize mental health or any kind of diagnoses, and in deconstructing, I realized that I wanted to figure out whether or not I was neurodivergent. There had always been this kind of rumor when I was younger that maybe I was autistic. The doctors had suspected ADHD for the longest time, and the only things that they did was send my parents home with a book on ADHD that was like this thick, and they didn't really do anything about me being autistic. It was more so the ODD that they said I had, which nowadays I would assume would be called PDA, persistent drive for autonomy or pathological demand avoidance, however you want to phrase it. And it was because of that I went to behavioral therapy for like maybe a couple months, but there was never anything officially saying like, they're autistic, and here's what you need to do about it. The ADHD was the main focus. And so fast forwarding to adulthood after dealing with a whole bunch of challenges, skills regression, burnout, trauma, all those different kinds of things, and recognizing that my brain was not functioning the same as everyone else, I consistently told my mom when I was younger that I felt like an alien who had crash landed on Earth. I was trying to learn the rules and customs that didn't come naturally to me. And I was like, why do I feel this way? And the more suddenly one day I stumbled upon neurodivergent Facebook. And this was when I was first starting to get a social media account of any kind after leaving, because in the high control space, you weren't allowed to have social media. And it was after getting on Facebook and one video came into my feed talking about ADHD. And that like triggered like a whole deep dive into neurodivergence and the difference in neurotypes. I, for the longest time, didn't even know what ADHD was or how it affected day-to-day life. I consistently thought that ADHD was just this hyperactivity that was found in kids, and eventually you grow out of it and it's in your past. And this was without the whole deliverance ministry mentality where you consistently think that God can take away those kinds of things that are oppressing you. And ADHD was one of those things. And I went back later on and looked in my childhood notes, and I had written consistently in like my prayer wishes, like, God heal me from ADHD, or God ensure that I'm like not having an autistic spirit or whatever. And it was the weirdest phenomenon to go back and read those after understanding neurodivergence and realizing it wasn't any kind of spirit or deliverance or sickness or any of that at all. It was literally a neurotype, and it was literally the way that my brain was developed, and that it wasn't something that was just me. It was actually something that was generational. And looking back on my family, I have numerous generations of people who had both ADHD and autism, or just ADHD. And when I look back now, understanding the neurotype and understanding neurodivergence, I realized the majority of my family was neurodivergent. And that's why half of the challenges and the clashes that we had were the case, is because we were all neurodivergent and butting heads in the same house, and none of us had addressed it. And so, yeah, I went from the ADHD video that was like, what are the signs that you might have ADHD? And then I saw it and I was like, this looks like me. Like, piles everywhere, can't stay organized, bad with money, impulsively buying or doing things because it gives you a boost of dopamine, random bouts of depression, like all of this stuff that was associated with ADHD that they were naming. And I was like, I think that's me. And I'd remembered, because it was more prominent, that the doctors had said, more than likely, she has ADHD. And I was just like, okay, so that makes sense, because I never knew what that was before. I thought it was a hyperactivity that I grew out of. Now it makes sense. And then from ADHD, I somehow stumbled upon the autism community, and I started seeing videos talking about, what does it mean to be autistic? What does it feel like to be autistic? And a lot of people started to have the same experiences as me. We felt like aliens that had crash landed on another planet. We felt like robots, like all of these things that I've been saying my whole life, I ended up seeing in these videos. And I was just like, this is me. I felt visible. I felt seen. I, for the first time ever, had been like, maybe there's more to my brain than just feeling insignificant and not being able to stay organized. And maybe there is a root cause of these things, and these are the outcomes, rather than me just being a lazy, unproductive person who doesn't know how to stay organized, which had been my common assumption and had been fed to me since I was a kid, right? That if you don't do what you're supposed to do, what are your responsibilities, then you're just lazy and you don't feel like doing work, and we don't, have people sit around the house to be lazy. So I went for a diagnosis in 2024. And I was traveling out of the country at the time that I had just finished or was about to finish the assessments. It was extremely long. And after a long time of waiting, I get my results back, and she says, without a shadow of a doubt, you are autistic. And the report also said that I qualified for an ADHD diagnosis and a PTSD diagnosis. And later on this year, I found out that I also had a OCD diagnosis. And so between all of that, I finally was able to understand why I had so many barriers, limitations, and challenges as a young kid, and why I consistently felt out of place, and why I consistently felt isolated. And the more that I started to search out support groups and spaces where people were like me, the less and less that I felt alone, the less and less that I felt like I had to hide my true self, and the more and more that I embraced who I was meant to be. Who was that, though? That's the biggest question, right? Everyone is so psyched about talking about what you do to get diagnosed, and then about what happens once I have the diagnosis and I'm living my most authentic life. But rarely do I see people talk about how you get to the point from being diagnosed to accepting your diagnosis and saying, I'm going to live a free, abundant life. How do we get there? Because if you've been masking your entire life, especially if you're coming from high control religion or a toxic environment or a toxic family, you don't really know who the real you is. And you've been so many different versions of yourself that it's very challenging to know who you want to be and why. And I had to, in the middle of my deconstruction journey with religion, I had to tie that into my deconstruction of self. Because for the longest time, religion had fueled, and the way that I saw religion had fueled the way I saw myself, right? You're consistently taught in Jesus-oriented religions that you are nothing without Jesus, or that your identity is hidden in Jesus. Some of the biggest scripture verses that are quoted, especially within high control Jesus-based religions, is that you are not your own, and your life has been hidden in Christ, and all of these other things that kind of center you not having personality, preferences, identity. There's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither bond nor free, there's neither male nor female. And that was never used to dispel the gender barriers that they embraced, but it was always used to show people that your culture didn't matter, your identity didn't matter, your neurotype didn't matter. These kinds of things that people called differences were those things that people said, oh, that doesn't matter at all, that's not important whatsoever. And it was only in deconstructing the idea of identity as it connects to spirituality that I got to understand really what it felt like to start living my authentic self. Before that, I was the scared, trying to be invisible young girl who always felt out of place in every space I would step into. Always felt like I had to perform twice as much for people to see me, for people to understand me, or for people to just leave me alone. And there was always this notion of the more that I create, the more that I produce, the more that I do for someone, the more that I give to people, the more that I do and give to God, the more that I will get love reciprocally in return. And it wasn't until I deconstructed and I started looking at, well, what are friendships? What does it really mean to be in a friendship? What are relationships? What does it really mean to be in a relationship? What is family? What does it really mean to choose your family? What is self? And what does it mean to live your authentic self? I heard all the lingo. I had been since I left the high control community. The first thing that you see when you type in leaving cults or leaving high control religion is a bunch of people talking about find your true self, find your authentic self, and here are the top steps to know that you've been in a traumatic situation. But there's not as much content about the nitty-gritty of you being in the thick of it. Not the beginning, not the end, but the middle. The part where you've acknowledged that you don't know who your true self is, but you don't really know how to get to your true self because it's been so buried. And for me specifically, a lot of times people will talk about leaving a cult or leaving high control religion as someone who's kind of entered it, either midlife, early life, or later in life, and then they get out and they have to deconstruct. I was born into this. So I had no other identity to go back to. I had nothing else to refer to. So the easiest thing to do, especially as an autistic person, is to look at every other person and say, well, they're doing this, so I'm going to do that. They're saying this, so I'm going to say that. They're trying this, so I'm going to try that. And I knew that I didn't want to go there. Because as soon as I go there, as soon as I went there, I would just build another imposter version of myself, another mask for myself, another identity for myself that still wasn't my true, real self. It is only in getting rid of all of the other stuff, all of the other components that I thought made me who I was, and starting from the bare bones basics of what are my values? What do I believe? What don't I believe? What are my non-negotiables in life? How do I want people to treat me? How will I treat other people? And what religious system aligns best with those values? That I landed at my present Jewish journey where I am now, the belief that God still exists, and the belief in who I am as an individual. And that's how I eventually got to my non-binary identity, which I will talk about in later episodes. It's how I discovered that I was queer. It's how I discovered my neurotype. It's how I learned to embrace working with my brain instead of against it. And it's how I truly started to live as a person who was unapologetically all of me. And it's where I eventually came up with a curriculum and with an idea and with a framework that I will be releasing later on in the year, centered around Jewish mysticism and Jewish spirituality that talks a lot about identity and becoming the best version of who you are. And that's why you'll see in a lot of the songs that I've created and all these things that I talk about being the best version of me, because that's exactly what it is, right? I'm wanting to be the best version of myself. And that's what I really learned deconstruction truly meant. A lot of people look at deconstruction and the deconstruction journey and they're surprised by me. Because a lot of people who deconstruct, especially young people, they will say, well, I want nothing to do with religion at all. I am done with religion. I'm done with organized religion. I'm either just going to be a spiritual person or I'm not going to believe in anything at all. And for me, I knew I didn't want to go there because I had experienced too much from Hashem, even within the framework that I was in before in the high control religion, to say that Hashem didn't exist. I'd seen too many things. I'd engaged with too many different things. I had known and heard too much. And even when I was feeling low and down and saddened and I was going through trauma and I was experiencing abuse and all these different kinds of things, I called out to God. And I experienced peace in those moments when I thought no one was listening to me and no one was valuing me. And I experienced God that way. So it was impossible for me to give up on the idea of God. No matter who God turned out to be, I always knew I would continue to believe in the origin of life as something bigger than myself. And that my origin and my end would be something bigger than me. And when you surrender every other belief and say, I'm starting completely from scratch. If I end up in the same place where I'm at, okay. If I end up somewhere completely different, okay. You surrender to that process. That is real deconstruction. Deconstruction is not about abandoning religion. Can it lead to that? Yes, it can, because for some people, religion is not the best fit for them. And I will say that. Gasp. Yes, I will say that as an aspiring rabbi, as someone who is highly spiritual and highly religious. I am okay with people not being religious because religion is not for everybody. Now, when we get into the idea of Jewish culture, Jewish heritage, Jewish responsibility, now that's a different topic, but in general, for people, for everyone, every human, the path to faith, spirituality, religion, and God has to be your own. And if your path leads you to Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, no religion, whatever it is, that is where your soul is calling you, because everything is connected to God. Whatever you believe God to be, everything in life is connected to that. And so I did not give up on religion in my deconstruction journey. I embraced religion in my deconstruction journey because I realized that it wasn't God's fault, the things that I went through. That was another thing that I didn't do, was blame God, because I had known God. Even before I came out of the high control religion, as I said, I've had experiences experiencing the divine in what I knew at the time that I can't remove from my memory. And so it was always in me, like, the things that you experienced, the trauma that you went through, the things that were done in God's name, that was not God. That was the misappropriators of God's actual love and compassion and kindness and the words that he spoke. That was not God. And so I could not blame God for things that I knew he wasn't responsible for and that I knew he did not do. And so it was never on me to say, well, I don't believe in God, or I don't trust God, or call out to God and be like, why did you do this to me? Because I'm just like, people did this to me and they have free will. And if people did this to me, then I need to find better people. And that's the path that I took in my deconstruction journey, is before going into new spaces, what kind of person do I want to be? What kind of people do I want to attract? And what kind of environments do I want to create and that I want to engage? And that's when I realized that I wanted to pursue being observant and Jewish, embrace my patrilineal Jewish roots, and return to Judaism and its normative practice. That's when I realized that I wanted to finally pursue my lifelong dream of being a rabbi. Yes, I had ambitions to be a rabbi ever since I was a child. I was doing davar with my stuffed animals, even when it was against the rules in the religious community that we were in for women to be in roles of religious leadership. I always looked out and I said I would want to be a rabbi. I really want to be a religious leader, a rabbi. And of course, it got diluted and changed over time, but the core belief of it stayed exactly the same. And it came back to me as I deconstructed that this was something that I could do and that I felt empowered to do and that I wanted to do. And that's what I ended up pursuing. And so I submitted my application, and that's the dream that I've always had. So deconstruction connects a lot with my journey into exploring neurodivergence. It connects a lot with my journey into understanding myself. And in future episodes, I'll get more into what that looks like and what that means and how that worked for me and the specific framework that I used. But in summary, it was really a values-based unmasking and a values-based deconstruction. If I can recognize the values that guide my life and I can recognize the values that guide my existence, then even when I unmask, I'm not going to be throwing things at people in the supermarket because they get overstimulated. I'm going to find other outlets for that anger, for that frustration, for that overstimulation that don't involve harming people, because my value is that I want to be a safe space for people. Right? That's what I mean. Like, if a lot of people unmask and they're like, I'm just going to randomly throw things in the store, I'm going to punch people, I'm going to scream at people because I'm neurodivergent and I have allowed society to determine my traits and my behaviors for too long, so now I'm unmasking, I'm showing my true self. But if that is the true you, that has nothing to do with neurodivergence. If you want to be violent and mean and terrible to people, then that is just you and your inner person and your inner behavior. It doesn't give you the excuse to be a jerk just because you find out that you're neurodivergent. And that's the biggest fear that people had about me when I got diagnosed, was that I was suddenly going to start acting wild and doing crazy things because I had a piece of paper that told me I was autistic and told me that I had ADHD. And so all of a sudden now, what some people called it in my life was giving in to the diagnosis. Which means that you allow it to define you, you allow it to determine what you do and what you don't do, and now it's your get out of jail free card anytime that you get into trouble or do things people don't like, and you could just say, oh, I'm autistic, so you'll have to forgive this behavior. That's not what a diagnosis is for. That's not what I ever plan on using a diagnosis for, and that's not what I encourage people who I mentor to use their diagnosis for. Being neurodivergent is not an excuse to mistreat people and to be terrible. There are toxic neurodivergent people, like there are toxic neurotypical people. Like there are toxic holistic people. There are toxic autistic people. I have met some. I have engaged with some. Okay? I've had to cut off some. There's no excuse to be a jerk simply because you are neurodivergent. Okay? So when I first got diagnosed, everybody was worried. They were like, oh, she's going to start doing all this extra stuff. She's going to start using it as an excuse, as a crutch with some of the things that I was told. And that's not the truth at all. I used my diagnosis to be able to get accommodations at work, to be able to get accommodations at school, which I had to fight for, which is a whole other episode. I used my paperwork in order to tell people about my diagnosis and inform myself so I would know what to expect and what accommodations I can make for myself. I used it so that I would know, hey, I can get a sunflower lanyard and then I can ask for assistance at airports. And maybe sometimes I can even get pre-boarding because it is a cognitive disability. And so I can ask to have more time to get onto the plane because being in that crowd of the rush to get into the plane is very overstimulating and it is challenging for me and it is hard. I can wear headphones in loud environments because that helps me feel better and helps me adapt to the world and still be able to function. Maybe going to the supermarket is frustrating and exhausting for me because of all the flashing lights and sounds. So if I wear headphones and sunglasses indoors in stores, that's totally fine. I started accommodating myself, working with myself, and I started getting specialized therapy that supported my journey. So I got a therapist who was neuroaffirming after a bout with a therapist who helped me when I first got out of the high control religion, but when I got diagnosed, they didn't understand neurodivergence. And so they told me things like, well, I still think that you're a high functioning autistic person, so there's not much for you to worry about. Like those kinds of things. And I didn't appreciate that, and I didn't think that was neuroaffirming. And so I changed therapists, and I got a therapist who was actually neurodivergent herself and does really well with helping me be able to engage with my neurodivergent thoughts and address the rumination and all of that. And then eventually this year, I got a therapist that helps me specifically with the OCD and the stress. And that has been super duper helpful. And so now I was able to get specialized therapy to help me address the components of my neurodivergence that I wanted to improve character-wise. And that's a difference that a lot of people don't get when you're engaging with neurodivergence, is that there's a difference between the character traits that you want to improve that are fed into the neurodivergence and trying to say, I'm going to fix parts of myself that are neurodivergent. There is no way to make it where you don't get overstimulated. I'm sorry to say. There's no way to make it where you don't get frustrated or flustered at certain situations that you don't understand. There's no way to completely solve your communication challenges. But there are ways to improve the way that you handle those situations, to improve the way that you manage those situations, and to allow yourself to not put yourself in those situations to begin with, or if you are, ways to be able to cope. And so I started going to conferences with my fidget toys. I started leaving conferences early when they got too crowded and too loud. I started telling people my needs, and I needed a sensory room when I went to certain spaces. I started really working hard to engage with the world in a way that still allowed me to feel good about myself at the end of the day. And I realized as I started doing this that my self-esteem started to slowly but surely increase. Because now it wasn't, what's wrong with me? I'm broken. I can't do these things. I don't know how to do these things. I don't know why I'm not able to do these things. And it changed into, how can I work with my brain to get this done? Is this something that I need to do now? Or are there more important things that I need to focus on and I can handle this later? Do I need to say yes to this person? Or do I need to tell them no because it's not the best for my mental health? Is this person someone that I want to be around? Or is it someone that I feel obligated to be around simply because I feel like I should? Those are the kinds of questions I started asking. Those are the kinds of things, and once you know your values, you can start answering those questions based on your values instead of having to jump on the spot and say, oh, I've got to think super hard about this. If someone is toxic and they're causing me stress and they're making me feel like I have to walk on eggshells, guess what? That person is not going to be in my life anymore. Or they're going to be minimal contact because I can't handle it. My system can't handle it. My nervous system can't handle it. And I know that. So my value is safety and peace are always prioritized over anything else. And so since that was a value that I had, a value of safety and a value of making and keeping peace, then anything that violates those values, I automatically know doesn't align with my life. And so even if they were a part of a previous stage in my journey, even if they were a part of a previous moment, being able to define my values and update my life to continuously align with those values once they keep getting out of turn, that helps me continue to live my life confidently and securely and with joy and peace. And I can't say that I have officially fully gotten there. Of course, there's still a lot of things for me to unpack. I'm still crying in my therapy sessions over experiences and challenges and journeys and new experiences that I'm having for the first time. But guess what? I'm growing and I can track the growth. 2 years ago, I wasn't able to cut my hair because I was in a community that told me that you couldn't cut your hair as a woman. Now I have a style of shaved sides and I've made my hair, I've embraced my locks. Okay, a couple of years ago, I would have thought that being queer was a sin, and now I identify as queer. Okay, a couple of years ago, I thought I was broken and that there was something wrong with me and that there was no way for me to be able to improve because my brain just didn't like me. And those were verbatim words that I said. And now I'm learning that I'm autistic with ADHD and OCD, and the challenges that I was experiencing was due to me not addressing and working with my brain and addressing my needs and stopping the generational trauma of consistently being undiagnosed and inflicting more pain onto other people. When I have kids, B'Tzrat Hashem, more than likely through adoption, I'm not going to treat them the same way that I was treated or that my parents were treated, or their parents before them. Lines and lines of an unbroken chain of neurodivergent people who simply took all their anger and frustration of being rejected by the world out on their kids and didn't really know how to love and care for their kids the way that they should, because they were raised to think that being a tough authoritarian parent was the way to keep your kids out of harm's way and was the way to give them the best love. And that included thinking that you could correct all of the neurodivergence out of them or pray it all away. And that's not true at all. And I think I've broken those chains automatically, because that was a big fear when I was younger, is what if I end up like my parent? What if I end up like, their stories of their childhood? Like, what if I end up being the same person or repeating the same patterns? And that's not true. And I only have, specifically, my mom and I had a very healing and redemptive relationship now, because we've both been able to address not only our generational trauma, but also the neurodivergence that we both have. I've also personally taken the responsibility to say, I'm going to get the help. I'm going to go to therapy. I'm going to do the work to ensure that I don't take all the anger out on my kids, that I don't nitpick on them for things they can't control, that I don't make them feel like they're less than because they're neurodivergent and because their brain works different, and that I understand what they're going through and recognize the signs early so that they don't have to spend their entire life feeling like they're broken. And I think that's the biggest thing that I've learned from my journey, from high control religion to diagnosis to self-expression and identity, is that it's not about the unmasking. It's not about all the cool terms. It's not about all the terminology. It's not about being woke. It's really about, who am I and what kind of person do I want to be and what kind of life do I want to live? And what kind of legacy do I want to leave for my kids? And what ways am I going to change what happened to me so it's not repeated? And I feel like I've successfully been on that journey. I have been doing that. I've been chipping away at it. And in future episodes, I'll talk more about how I've been doing that and how I've been embracing my identity. But for now, I just wanted to kind of share that post-diagnosis journey, because I think a lot of times I get very irritated when I hear people talk about, oh, you're giving into your diagnosis, you're using it as a crutch, you're using it as any of these kinds of things, or I'm scared to get a diagnosis because, or any of those kinds of things. I get really irritated when people make it seem like the diagnosis makes you what you already have been for your entire life, right? The diagnosis makes you autistic. No. The diagnosis makes you ADHD. No. The diagnosis is confirming what you've already been living. It's validation. It's more proof to help you become the person that you want to be. It's a tool in your toolkit. It's not a crutch. It's not a way out. It's not any of those kinds of things. It's really a means for you to continue to grow and educate yourself about how your brain works so that you can feel confident in who you are. Okay, so I'll share more in upcoming episodes, but until next time, I'm Nasia, and this was Living Confident.